Today we're going to paint this mini autumn landscape. We're using a few more colors than I typically do, and we're using a 9x12 that has been cut down into 6 smaller sheets of paper. So once you have your sheet of paper that's been cut down, you can tape it. I like to tape the edges so that it has a nice clean border. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to grab our pencil and we're going to map out a few sections of our painting. So before I get started, I always take my reference image. I like to print these out. And what I'll do is I'll map out mark out just a few little areas on the border of my picture. This helps me identify things like where the road starts, how wide it is, where that first mountain is, just a few things like that. So I'm going to mark out the same thing that I did before. So the road, kind of where that middle ground is, and the mountain. So now I have these lines in. There might be a couple things that I'll do to make sure that I understand the placement. So like the road to me is key. So that starts at about here. If I draw right on top of that, it's about a 1/2 inch up. So I am gonna mark out where that road ends. And for me, I am gonna draw that so that I can really see it, okay? You don't have to do this part, but I do think it helps a lot, makes it a lot more accurate. And then the other thing I might do is, a couple things that I don't want to miss, like maybe this tree right here. I'm just going to do kind of a faint outline. And what else? Let's do the edge of that. That's good. Okay, now that we have a few of these lines in, what we're going to do is start painting the sky. I'm going to use some Payne's Gray and the wet into wet method in the sky. So I'm just going to grab a larger brush and I'm going to wet the sky. And I'm going to go slightly over that edge of where my mountains are going to be. And I'm going to let that sit for a minute and get some paint ready. And I am using Payne's Gray mostly, but I'm also going to use a teeny tiny amount of Prussian blue. I thought this was just a little too gray for me. I wanted to brighten it up. So I'm going to use a little bit of Prussian blue to make it not so gray. But if you want to keep to the reference image, you definitely can. So while the surface is still wet in the sky, I'm going to focus on these clouds. Anytime I drop paint in and wet into wet, I start where it is the darkest area because it's going to spread. So if it spreads in the darker area, you can kind of control it a lot more. And if you drop it in the lighter area, you're not going to be able to control it as much. So always, that's my rule of thumb, always start where it's darkest. And then you can add more as you need it. I'm going to drop in a little bit more. And if it's not moving the way that you want, depending on what kind of paper you're using, take just a damp brush and wiggle it out. You don't want it to be sopping wet. Okay, and I hope you have noticed I'm kind of leaving that top right corner blank or unpainted so that I can add this light tree right on top of it. You can make it slightly gray, but don't make it too dark. Otherwise, you're not really gonna be able to add this later. And let me just set this out so you can see it. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna mix up this kind of light blue, kind of grayish blue color for that first layer of mountains. And we'll add a little bit of green to it for each layer that comes after it. So I've already added, I'm using Prussian blue with a tiny bit of Payne's Gray. And I always test it out on a swatch so that I really can see what it looks like before I apply it to my paper. I'm going to go a hair darker than what I actually think I need because remember, it's going to dry lighter after you apply it. So once it's dry, it always is going to look lighter. So I'm going to first add that blue mountain, and I'm just painting directly here. And I'm going to go over a tiny bit of that treetop there. I'm gonna let that dry. This next layer that's to the right of that blue mountain, you don't even have to wash your tray or your brush out. Grab a little bit of Hooker's green, mix it directly into the color that you already have, because you really want it to be just a step greener than the color that you just added. Because remember, we're making it just a little bit warmer. I'm gonna start in the darkest area. I'm actually gonna wash some of that out. And then what I'm hoping to do with this side, because remember, I'm gonna have that tree right here, I want it to look more like a gradient. So I'm gonna keep it darker right here and then wash my brush out and drag that color out with a clean, damp brush. That's gonna create this nice kind of gradient effect. It's gonna maintain this dark area, but make it look softer up here so that you can really see that top tree and it's not gonna look too green, because we wanna maintain that orange look. Now that we have these two layers, we're gonna move on to the next one. I'm adding a tiny bit of green to the color that I just made for this mountain. And I'm gonna add a little bit of Payne's gray because I want it to be a duller kind of gray green. So now, just like I did up here where I have the gradient on one side, I'm gonna do the same thing, but I want the gradient on the bottom. So I'm gonna start in the darkest area where my mountain is. I'm gonna paint over that edge, bring it down. And here I'm making just a few streaks at the base because it kind of goes dark, light, light again. So I'm gonna go down to that tree, wash my brush out. Now this is, you gotta be quick about it before it dries on the surface. And I'm gonna just wiggle that out. It's cauliflowering just a little bit because it dried too fast. So if it's drying too fast, just wiggle that edge and then it'll soften. There you go. You can always fix that. So if you don't like that hard edge, go back, drop in more paint at the top anyways, so it's a little bit darker while the surface is wet. You could also do that with the wet into wet technique and it would look really soft. But sometimes when you paint the area where you're working, if it's really small, it's harder to control that wet into wet surface. So if you're just starting out, you're learning how to do watercolor, the smaller a section is that you're trying to paint, don't do wet into wet. I just don't recommend it. You can do this kind of outline method that I like to do. Okay, we're gonna let that dry. Now this is the cool thing, we keep going back and forth, so we always have something to paint with this little landscape. Now that we have our sky and our 3 layers of mountains, we're gonna work on this first light kind of orangey layer right here. I am going to use a little bit of raw sienna, which looks very yellowy, which is nice, okay? And I'm gonna just paint most of that area with the raw sienna, just really lightly. And I'm painting directly, but with plenty of paint. So I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna stop basically where the road is. And I'm gonna grab some water and kind of drag that out. And now that I have most of that area painted, I'm gonna drop in a little bit of burnt sienna, which looks kind of orangey, really good pumpkin color. And I'm gonna do stripes. And at first this isn't gonna make much sense, but you're gonna just trust the process, okay? So we're gonna add just a little bit right here. And you can even do almost like little lines, because what this is going to make it look like is little, these sections of orange trees. And we're gonna leave a gap where all of our green trees are. And I'm letting it fade to the right because again, I'm gonna add this tree up here and I don't want it to get too dark too fast on the right-hand side. And then I'm just gonna fill in a little spot here with some of the raw sienna to create this really bright tree right here. You can use orange or add some yellows to it, but I don't think it's necessary, and I think that it's actually gonna make your image look less realistic because it's not you know, when you use tube paint like that, it can just be so bright. Okay, now we really need to let that dry before we do anything else. So we'll come back in a second once that's dry, and we'll add some more layers. But what we can do is add a little bit of that color to the left-hand side while that's drying. So I'm painting directly this time, and I'm going to kind of cover part of this tree that I put in there because that's going to be this light colored tree. So I'm going over that tree just a little bit, and I'm using just watered down raw sienna to paint that area. Now I got a little too light, so I'm going to use a little bit more paint just to make it a bit more concentrated, but you want to keep it light because then you can really control the layering, and that's what's going to make this whole entire thing pop. Now what you can do, you can actually start to add a few of these kind of yellowy pops of color for the top of the tree because it's dry up here in that top right hand corner. So just do a few little dots, not a lot. Dot, dot, not a lot. If you're a teacher, you know what that is. Okay. All right. That looks great. We're going to leave that and we're going to keep layering up. Next up, we're going to work on some of the greener bits. Before we do our green, we're actually going to do a little bit of our road, which is Payne's Gray and a tiny bit of that Prussian blue again. And I'm just using this dirty area of my tray because I like to kind of keep it just around, because then you can create more harmony with your picture. So now that I've mixed up that gray, I'm going to start in the back, way back in the back of that road. Now if you look at this picture and you blur your eyes, it's actually lighter here and gets darker towards the front because there must be a pop of light kind of coming down. So what you can do is you can start in the darkest area and then drag it out and make it a little bit lighter as you move towards the back. So I'm going to start on the edges here with my road and right in the middle too, actually. Wash my brush out. And then I'm going to blend those lines so they're nice soft edges against that paint that I just added. I'm still using my size 6 brush. And I like this brush, especially when I'm doing tiny stuff, because when it's small like this, the bristles are dense and it stays pretty stiff, which is what you need. Dense and stiff is what you need when you're working in a small area and you're trying to create a lot of detail. Now that I have the road, if I wanted to, while the surface is wet, I can drop in just a little bit more color here. Just the same exact color, I'm just adding more to make it look a little bit more realistic. But we're just doing this for fun. It's not going to be the most realistic painting ever. This is just a really nice, simple landscape. So that is drying. What we can do now is we're going to keep layering up like we've already done, and we're going to add intense, layer by layer, more color. So just like what I did here, we're going to add some of the green layers here and here, and then we'll build up some of these darker oranges. So let's get our green, which is Hooker's Green. And again, I'm mixing it into that dirty part of my tray because I don't want my paint to be ultra bright. And I'm adding a tiny bit of Payne's Gray and some water because I want to start with a really dull green as my base and then build up, kind of like I did here. Now don't do this if your road is still wet, okay? So mine is almost dry. Oh, that's so dark, so I'm gonna actually lighten it up just with a little water. And I'm gonna drag that out. There we go, that's what I wanted. And I want it really light near the edge of the road because I still want to create some space for those piles of leaves there. So you don't want it to be really dark and green right next to the edge of that road, otherwise you're not going to see the pop of red. Now while that is wet, I'm going to grab more paint, a little bit more Hooker's Green. I'm actually going to grab a tiny bit of my burnt sienna or some of my raw sienna to kind of warm that up a touch. And I'm going to darken it with a little bit of my Payne's Gray. gonna drop in some of those shadows. They almost look like stripes, like tiger stripes. I'm gonna drop those in, just like I did here. And I'm gonna use the leftover that's in my brush to kind of fill in this area. I'm gonna wipe off some of that paint because I don't want it to be too dark. And as it recedes, let's make that a little bit lighter and grayer. Great. Now we can keep adding some oranges into our orangey trees. So I'm going to use my raw sienna, a little bit of my burnt sienna, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just drop some of that in. I'm going to make it a little bit wetter, and I'm going to start to imagine where some of these branches might be. So I'm going to go plop, plop, plop. These are different little sections here. So I'm going to identify, I'm going to kind of build up some of these clusters. Let's use more of that burnt sienna because it's going to look more orange. And drop that in while it's wet. And then I'm just going to kind of do a bunch of it. Now, if you want it redder, you're going to use some alizarin crimson. So I'm mixing a little alizarin crimson into that burnt sienna that I just made. And while the surface is wet, where I just did those sections, I'm going to drop it in just at the base because that's going to make it look like it has a shadow underneath and make it look kind of rounded. There we go. And then I'm also going to start working on this section over here so I can use some of that red. Maybe there's this teeny little bush over here. And if you look at the reference image, that's kind of what I was going for. So just blobs, really. It's not, you're not worried about making it perfect. I am going to grab a little bit of that orange if I need to brighten a few things up, but I'm going to use it sparingly. I really don't want, I just want a little pop here and there. Like maybe that's that tree, and I'm just going to do maybe 2, maybe 3, and just a little up there. So we just did our orange layer. Now we're going to go back to our Hooker's green. I'm grabbing a little bit of Hooker's green in my tray, tiny touch of that blue, and a little bit of Payne's gray to kind of dull it down. And this is going to be really fun. So now we're going to paint these trees right here. Since I have a lot of paint in my brush, again, this is the tip, start wherever it's the darkest, because if you're not sure how much paint or how dark it is, I'll start in an area where I know I can darken it up. So it doesn't look like it, but we're almost done with this. So I'm gonna first paint that tree over here. I like to do a line and then kind of zigzag back and forth. And I'm gonna let this dry, and then I'll do a darker layer next. Now if there's too much white, I'm just gonna make this tree bigger so I can cover up that white. There we go. And remember, it's just kind of peeking through over here. And I'm going to use the same green for a first layer of my other dark tree, my other green tree. So line, kind of this little thing here, and kind of zigzag back and forth. If you need a tutorial on trees, there's tons out there, but if you want to see how I make mine, I don't have one on YouTube quite yet, but I have a great one on Instagram that you can check out. It shows you how, a few different ways that I like to make trees. So if you need some help with that, definitely check that out. I'll probably end up making one here as well, but if you need one right away, go for it. Got some easy methods. So now we're just putting in more of those green trees. I'm starting light and then I'll darken them up. So right now, these look really light in comparison to my reference image, but it's actually a perfect first layer. We're gonna use the same green And we're going to make these trees that are way in the distance, kind of just popping through. Now remember I said we're layering, and so in this little middle layer, that's where I'm gonna add these darker trees. So let's just do just a few little lines and some lines up here. It just looks like stripes, and that gives the illusion that, you know, there's some trees way in the distance. There's all these really beautiful trees. And that looks pretty good. Let's make this tree a little bit bigger. And you can add some detail in the front, just plop some more color in if you want. So this painting, once you get to this point, you can decide how detailed you want to go. So you can keep watching and add all these additional details, or if you feel like that looks really nice and soft and subtle, just keep it as is. And I think either way, you're going to have a really pretty painting. I'm going to build up some of my reds and a little bit more of my oranges so that I can intensify these details, and before I add the final branches and the tree trunks. So anytime that you're adding a shadow to your trees, you know, I kind of think of it like a bowl shape. So the bottom of your bowl, in those like tree clusters, the bottom of your bowl will always be darker. And I'm just going to plop in some random stuff and use some of that red right on the road to show that there's just a ton of leaves everywhere. And you want to overlap that line that you originally created, and a little bit into this hillside too. So I'm just doing a bunch of dots basically. And let's do a few more in here. A few more dots. Let's just fill this up a little bit more. Now, what you can do is you can start, I'm actually going to add a little bit more red. So this is the thing about me, as I can't stop adding detail. It's very hard for me to make a kind of soft and subtle picture because I get a lot of joy out of adding those layers. Okay, but I'm going to stop. And now I'm going to make these nice branches. And the trick to these branches, you're using mostly Payne's Gray, add a tiny bit of your burnt sienna. And all you're going to do is you're going to make a line and then let it kind of almost like dashed lines. That makes it look like the trunk of the branch is behind a cluster of leaves. So if you're ever wondering how to do that, that's all you do. Just break the line up and all of a sudden the image will come together. So I'm going to grab some of my burnt sienna and my Payne's Gray, which makes a really beautiful brown. That's a little too dark. Whoops. Let's show you that brown. Brown, that's really dark brown. And I'm going to start at the top, and I'm just kind of little V shapes to start. See how all of a sudden it just turns into a tree? Kind of amazing, actually. Didn't look like much, and now all of a sudden you can see it, which is pretty cool. And if you're working in a really tiny space and it's very difficult for you to make these fine lines, either grab a smaller brush, like a size 3, or something else, even smaller than that. Or you could even just do this with a pen. I think that would look really good. You can decide how many branches you want and where they're coming from. There. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side with some of these little red trees. And maybe let's pretend that there's something here too. Sure. There we go. And the final layer, which is very fun, is your dark green. So again, Hooker's green, Payne's gray, we're almost done here. And we'll add the final layer on top of those trees. And this is what I call kind of a halo or ghost technique. So the goal with this, when you do that second layer, make sure that you can see the first layer. Because if you can't, that means that it's not going to look as realistic. Look at that. Now it just pops. And, you know, I'm just going to add a tiny bit for this tree that's way in the back. And then this one, I might just add a little bit because you don't want to draw attention away from the big pretty tree on the right. Okay, look at that. So stinking cute. Love this stuff. I hope you had a ton of fun with this. If you have any questions at all, how to do any parts of this painting, please let me know in the comments. I love helping people out with watercolor, and so don't hesitate if you have any questions. If you are excited about painting something else, let me know. Let me know in the comments. I definitely would like to share more. All right, take a look at this. 2 different examples, same painting. Nice. All right, everybody, have a great day.